All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Please excuse me for a little bit of the disheveled look. I've just come back from the lab today, as of the time and the day I'm recording this. At least I don't know exactly when this will be out in public, but I figured to try something different and to give my perspective that many of you seem to appreciate and I'm very humbled by, pertaining to the show called The Last of Us. Now, for those that are not familiar, The Last of Us is based on a video game that is approximately I believe 10 years old, if I'm not mistaken, a very, very popular video game, and it's based on a male, we could say, a protagonist and his little young friend, female young friend named Ellie, and the male is named Joel, and basically they're in a post-apocalyptic world, essentially, and the one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this and do a video on this specifically for the members, and I don't know if this will go public or not, at least as of the time I'm recording this, is that as of the day and time this is being recorded, there have been 5 episodes so far that have been released on HBO, Crave, wherever you watch it. And I find the science in particular to be very, very compelling and incredible. And when I say the science, I'm speaking specifically to the concept of how there seems to be very strong feasibility behind the fact that if the human body's temperature were to lower enough for the fungi to then get into the body and then not be killed by the body and the immune system, but rather allowed to continue to disperse and then infect and affect the rest of the body. Now, obviously, there's the entertainment factor, of course, of, there being this type of zombification and all of that. And I don't completely rule out the behavior side of it. Now, of course, there's the Hollywood angle with the vast amount of spreading of the fungi itself and all of this, and I don't necessarily think that it's impossible. I think that within a recent time frame or relatively modern time frame in terms of us being alive and all of that, I don't think that it will happen. But at the same time, again, I'm just watching my words here because I'm not trying to make this political. I'm not trying to correlate this with anything realistic. But again, it's difficult to not think back to a couple events in recent history, which is that if this type of, we could say, cordyceps, this particular type of fungi in particular, were to be modified in the laboratory, it's very feasible that this is indeed possible. And I wanted to give my perspective on this because I think the show in and of itself, I think, is a fantastic show. I think is written very, very well. I've seen little to no, if at least off the top of my head right now, shows or movies that have adapted video games so well, particularly when the story itself was canonical within the video game, meaning it started as a video game before anything else, basically, if I'm not mistaken. And one thing that I find very incredible about this is that if you look at the way in which people, in terms of humans in this post-apocalyptic world, tended to become very tribalized and work itself into different camps and groups and basically have sort of a I don't give an F mentality, so to speak, it becomes very, very interesting. And the reason I say that is because it speaks to this concept slightly, in my opinion, where if there was some type of disclosure amongst the masses, and I'm not trying to fearmonger and say that is what is going to happen, but it is certainly one of the downsides or glass half empty perspectives I think could or should be taken if we were to look at this in terms of if extraterrestrials or something like this, interdimensional beings, you name it, were revealed to any extent, if the world would go into that type of disarray. I would like to think no, but I'm also honest with myself in the sense that the people that I work with and the sort of bubble that I'm in is a very scientific one. And so for me, it's all about exploration and progress. But I have to also remind myself that I have to step outside sometimes of where I'm existing within and try and think of the average person that is, going to work 9 to 5. And as I've said in previous member Zoom calls, the farthest extent they've experienced of any type of extraterrestrial or even perceived extraterrestrial event or scenario or encounter is that of watching Independence Day, let's say. So I think when we look overall at the concept of how this general storyline has developed in particularly in The Last of Us, I think what we're seeing is something that is very, very realistic and feasible, both scientifically to a particular degree, in addition to the way in which we see human behavior would potentially spiral downwards into. Now, with that said, I would also like to think there would be groups of individuals that would be far more collaborative in terms of being able to create a community or something like this. Now, perhaps this is something we will see in the coming episodes. Again, as of the time and day I'm recording this, only 5 episodes have come out. There have, as we've seen so far in the show, been small communities. We've seen episode 3, Bill and Frank, the two male partners that were, in fact, honestly, if in my opinion, if there was ever any type of apocalyptic event, I would specifically want my property and my we could say household or wherever I would be staying to probably be holed up like Bill and Frank's property was in the show. Now, in terms of how would I keep myself busy during such an event, probably a combination of science, reading, and what you saw. I believe specifically Bill doing, to be more precise. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Bill. Yes. Now, at the same time, when we also look very closely at the different, we could say, types of zombies in particular, I think that when we look at scientific, we look at mutations in science, and we look at the way in which, and again, I am no expert by any stretch, specifically in the medical field or anything in that regard, but compared to others, at the very least, I think that the extent in which one could see different branch offs of different behavior of the fungi or the cordyceps in particular, and then the granularities of those branching offs in terms of how the different behaviors would occur and arise over time. I think it's possible. I think it would probably take far more than 20 years, given that, the according to the storyline of the show and the game, of course, the event occurs in 2003. And then we fast forward 20 years later to 2023. Now, obviously, to what would be modern day, and for those watching the show. Now, I think that, for example, I believe episode 1 or 2. I forgive me off the top of my head. Spoiler for those who haven't seen it. The one where essentially, probably about 10-15 minutes prior to Tess, Joel's partner, sacrificing herself to save Joel and Ellie from that horde or that wave of zombies, let's call them. We notice Tess saying to Ellie, explaining to Ellie when they're on the rooftop, looking down below at how the zombies behave, and Tess is explaining to Ellie how they all seem to sort of move and think and behave in the same type of manner, or in the same type of ebb and flow type state. It is of my humble opinion that is entirely accurate with respects to if there was an event like this. If there was some type of let's just say network based organism that could or would do this, it would probably operate in that regard. I don't see why it wouldn't, given the way in which, for example, if we were to correlate it to quantum physics, the way in which fractality and the wave function, particularly speaking to the Dirac equation in its non-relativistic form, tends to behave. And then especially when we look at the Schrodinger wave equation, when there's sort of a locking into a relativistic conjugate momenta, as it's called. So in other words, what I'm basically saying is, if we look at the behavior in which the wave function were to operate in a scientific regard, at least in my humble opinion, and then we correlate that to sort of the movements that we saw in the scene where Ellie and Tess are looking down from the building. I believe Joel as well. Joel's right behind Ellie and Tess, and they see the zombies sort of roll over collectively in the dozens, as if they're all kind of behaving as one. I think that is a very feasible set of mannerisms and behaviors that would be exhibited in some type of biological organism that, if using humans as hosts, could in fact enable and enact this type of effect. I think that is very feasible in terms of course, the different levels of, or the different grades of zombies, in which, you have ones that are more susceptible and sensitive to sound, and then you have ones that are very big and things like this. Of course, there's the sensationalization of Hollywood there, but at the same time, if there were to be any type of mutation to the extent in which some branches of the cordyceps or the fungi would then mutate more so than others, I would perhaps speak to, I would say personally that, again, just from an abstract general overview, that would probably take more time than 20 years to develop. But again, this is just my opinion. I'm not saying this I'm trying to be scientific, but again, I would need more data, even if it were to be just BS data, in order to sort of correlate this. But if the that is if we're speaking of some type of natural occurrence that this fungi then cordyceps evolved into or devolved into, depending how you want to look at it, or maybe again, maybe it stayed the same and it's just because of our body temperatures that lowered that this even occurred, right? But I want to say that that is one case. Now, the second case is that if this was some type of fungi or organism that behaved in a sort of, I don't want to say conscious, but sentient network like manner that was modified in the laboratory, it would not surprise me if there were some type of branches of that modification that would be far more susceptible and permeable to much more accelerated mutation than other ones, truth be told. I think that is something that is certainly within the realm of possibility. I don't think that it's, again, I don't, at the end of the day, folks, and not to be cheesy in this regard, but anything and everything is possible. There have been a lot of things that have been studied in laboratories that, in my opinion, should not have been and still should not be. It's not even just from a moral or ethical issue, just for the sometimes I think we need to weigh the risk and reward of scientific exploration versus what could come from that exploration as a consequence of trying to push it too much. And then of course we have to ask ourselves, what are the limits we must set for pushing ourselves too far in that regard. But that's for a different conversation. Again, in terms of the way the show works overall, I think it's very well done, very well written. I'm not a movie or film reviewer, but I know a lot of you have been asking lately, especially in the private messages, what I think of certain shows or books or whatever. So I figured I would do a video like this where we reviewed that. And I'm just trying to see off the top of my head if there's anything from the show in particular that I missed. Again, quick recap. If it was me doing this, I would try and sort of do like a Bill type role where you kind of set up camp somewhere very isolated and remote and over the months and then therefore the years develop a sort of defensive boundary or perimeter around where you live. That's something that I would definitely and probably try and strive for at the very least. When you look at the big picture, this concept of there being some type of a vaccine or there being an attempt to look for some type of cure in terms of the way that the biting would be transmitted, I don't know anything about that. I don't want to say yes, but I also don't want to say no. Because we understand strongly how in many regards the same way we eat things or whatever, that if the body were to ingest things in different ways, that perhaps a bite may in fact be able to be transmissible. But again, I don't want to go that far, but I also don't rule it out either. So I I think it is a unfortunate depiction of what the, forgive my profanity here, the shittier part of humanity would look like from an anthropological and social level with regards to you're trying to go through a city and then all of a sudden someone fakes being hurt and they pretend to need help, and then the next thing you go and try and help them, and then all of a sudden there's a whole other group of individuals that then trap you for either trying to steal your personal items and belongings, or worse. I think from a social level, I don't think there's any going easy in that regard. I hate to say it like that. I think that's one of the, I think it's the depiction of how Joel is very careful, and I appreciate the way that the filmmakers take their time to film the slow, subtle but significant relative to the correlation of the story and the character development personality of Joel. I really appreciate that because I think it shows, at least, I mean, okay, granted it's Hollywood, but I think it shows definitely the way in which at least the way in which I would like to think that I would behave in such situations, in terms of thinking, trying to stay calm in the context of what's going on around you, of course, and then deciding to make your next move, and then obviously being very physically, mentally vigilant as well. I think, there's a concept that really irks me, in the sense of, it irks me because it's, in my opinion, it's very feasible, which is that, again, not to jump all over the place here, but the idea of stepping on one little cordyceps or fungi strand and then waking up a whole other horde in another part of that geographical vicinity. I mean, look, I think of non-locality from spooky action at a distance, but that's a very practical action at a distance understanding of how basically the fungi travel through the planet or through the soil. Then, because they're a network, they connect to another group of hosts in which they are humans that act as hosts in which they have taken over. That wakes them up, and you're just walking. Next thing you know, you have a whole horde coming at you. That part scares me because to me that's a perfect example of a sort of centripetal fractal ripple, if that makes sense, or rather centrifugal, excuse me, very similar to the pine cones kissing type concept, honestly. So I think that's about it. Perhaps if you folks like this, I will do another video on this, or where it's just me doing a little bit of talking in terms of my personal opinion on the show and all that. I figured I would change it up a little bit. We have, as of the time I plan to release this, for the members, we have some incredible new concepts that are both very basic, also very complex, but we will merge them together into a harmonious way of understanding, that will be happening in the coming days or within the next week or two, depending on when this gets released. So, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll catch you all very, very soon. Thank you so much for pardoning me for the way that I look, not as prepared or proper looking as I normally am, but I really appreciate it, and we'll catch you all very, very soon. Thank you so much.